Hi, everyone. Joe Fitzgerald here, your host for the Visual Lease Data Institute podcast. I'm the SVP of Lease Market Strategy at Visual Lease, and we have an exciting topic to cover on this episode. This time, we'll be discussing GASB 96 with my colleague Rosemary Courtney, our Technical Accounting Director here at Visual Lease. I'll also be welcoming back Mike Vanscoy, Managing Director at Solomon Edwards Group. Rosemary is a CPA with over 30 years of experience in financial leadership roles. She has worked as both a senior executive and CFO in public, private, and not-for-profit companies with a proven track record in growth strategies and profit margin improvements. She also has extensive global experience in general accounting, accounting policy, financial closing, and reporting under US GAAP, IFRS, and SEC, along with technical expertise in complex, non-recurring transactions and SOX controls. Mike has more than 25 years of national and international experience in various aspects of technical accounting and financial reporting, financial accounting management, audit compliance, financial management standards, and international policies, controls, and procedures in IFRS, FASB, and GASB environments. He has extensive experience in accounting and reporting for public offerings, mergers and acquisitions, debt and equity transactions, and complex consolidation topics. I've asked both Rosemary and Mike to join us here today to address a recent GASB standard that organizations will need to adopt, GASB 96. So let's jump right in. Hello and welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, Mike.
Rosemary.
Hey guys. So let's start. Rosemary, let me start with you. What exactly is GASB 96 and why is it so important? Kind of give us the 101 breakdown.
Thanks, Joe. GASB 96 has to do with subscription-based information technology arrangements. So it's going through your contracts and identifying as a government their SaaS agreements, basically, and putting them on balance sheet for the first time, trying to make consistent treatment of these types of contracts for state and local governments.
So with that kind of a background, Mike, I know last time you and I spoke about GASB 87, and I'm curious, what do organizations need to do to prepare for GASB 96? And, maybe if you could compare and contrast it to, what they're doing to prepare for GASB 87.
Well, the good news is if your organization has gone through GASB 87, GASB 96 is going to look a lot like GASB 87. So what GASB 96 is doing, like GASB 87 was doing, is provide some uniformity to reporting over a specific area. So what 87 did for leases and putting all of the leases on the balance sheet and providing a solid set of guidelines for entities to follow, GASB 96 is doing the same thing for these subscription-based technology arrangements. And so just like under the lease standard, you're going to now have an asset and a corresponding liability related to all of these agreements that you didn't have before. So much like you did if you've gone through the adoption process, or even if you haven't gone through the adoption process on the new lease standard, you're going to have to do a lot of digging through your agreements, taking a look at and reading agreements and understanding what qualifies under the guidelines of GASB 96 for these subscription-based agreements that need to be put on the balance sheet. Pull those all together, consolidate that, and then start doing the same work that you did for GASB 87. So there are a lot of similarities and there are a lot of leveraging efficiencies, if you will, from what you've done or will do for GASB 87.
It's interesting. So, Rosemary, with that in mind, I know a lot of public entities are adopting 87 right now. So what's the timing on 96? And why do you think it is that entities are not doing both at the same time?
Well, Joe, I just got back from a GFOA conference in Austin, Texas, and that question was asked quite a few times in quite a few of the courses there. And the general consensus was that folks are still really kind of wrestling with their GASB 87 implementation. So they just really don't have the people power right now to pivot. But 96 follows on the heels of 87, and 96 is effective after June 15, 2022, and for all reporting periods thereafter. But basically, it's just capacity to get it implemented.
Interesting. So, Mike, with that in mind, I know when we talk about 87, it's heavy focused on, real estate's a big part of it. So I don't expect to see the real estate team involved in a 96 implementation, but are there other groups that are going to be more prominent in the cross-functional activities around 96 that maybe not as involved in the 87 transition?
Yeah, I think so. Mainly, GASB 96 is going to be mostly an IT function, right? Because we're talking about subscription-based information technology agreements. And for the folks who work in IT and in governmental entities, they're getting a double whammy, if you will, because under GASB 87, part of the work and part of the lift to adopt GASB 87 was looking for embedded leases, looking for through all of your contracts to look for elements of a lease. So we've just asked that group, along with other groups, to go through all of their contracts and try to scope in or scope out leases. Now that same group is going to have to go through even more work and go through all of their contracts to determine whether their arrangements with software providers meet the guidelines under GASB 96. And so that group in particular, but and along with accounting, because accounting has been involved obviously in both of these, from in terms of collating data, consolidating it, and coming up with new mechanisms for reporting, whether that's new accounts, new reconciliations, all of the things that come with financial reporting. But I would say that IT and accounting are going to take the brunt of 96, even for IT in particular, more so than they did under 87.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And Rosemary, I was flipping the GASB 96 standard, and I noticed there's this discussion about certain costs and implementation costs around these contracts, both kind of before, during, and after implementation. Maybe you can talk a little bit about those costs, if you don't mind.
Sure. So as Mike was describing, digging through contracts to look for embedded leases with these SBITA agreements, as they're called now, there's a deep dive to find the different cost stages of a contract, so that of actually the project of implementing the agreement. So there's preliminary project stage costs, and then there's initial implementation stage, and then operation and additional implementation stage. So there's sort of three buckets, and each of those has to be identified because some are expensed as incurred and some are capitalized. So it's nuanced. And I think you were with me, Joe, a while ago. We called the GASB and we were walking through some of that. And one of the project managers was sort of surprised that she hadn't gotten any Q&A on these. And sort of our initial instinct was that these are hard to find. And often, when you're negotiating, they're not always carved out. For example, sometimes your training costs are buried in the same contract. It goes to accounts payable. It's all one. So it's sort of hard to identify the discrete cost items for the different accounting treatments. So whereas I said they were busy with 87, they're also up against this sort of complexity of finding the costs. So there's a little more to it.
I do. Yeah, I remember that conversation. So, Mike, while these are not leases, there's obviously some similarities from what you guys are just talking about. So let me ask you a question. Many entities have implemented some form of lease accounting technology, right, for the GASB 87. How do you see them leveraging that technology as they move into the adopting 96?
Well, I think the technology needs are just as great as they were under 87. What people have found is that just like anyone who's adopted lease, whether in the private or the governmental area, is that day one you can calculate everything, but day two software does all the necessary work and reporting and consolidation that makes your life easier. Because GASB 87 and GASB 96 are so similar. In fact, so many of the terms are similar. We have a right to use asset under both. We have a lease liability under 87, and we have a subscription liability under 96. So we're talking about conceptually two standards that are very, very much alike. Just one for leases and one very specific for information technology agreements. So if you're using software and you've gotten used to the software that you use for 87, or if you're looking at software for 87, I would recommend that while you're looking at software for 87, consider that the same software provider or your options for 96. And if you've already gotten software for 87, consider using that software, or I'm sure those vendors providers such as Visual Lease have that same option for GASB 96. Because once you've gotten used to the 87 accounting and the 87 reporting, then GASB 96 application is going to be so much easier. You'll be able to leverage everything that you've learned from using the software for 87.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense, right? The technology's in place. Mm-hmm. You might as well leverage it rather than go out and get another solution. The processes, to great extent, are probably in place, both for transitioning as well as ongoing. So, Rosemary, any closing thoughts on 96? Maybe I could first ask you, and then Mike, maybe you could follow up with kind of a closing, your own closing thought.
My hunch is, and you might be able to clarify this for me, but observing with the 87 implementation is a little bit more of a difficult transition, whereas 96 should be more discrete because it's new. there's not as much of a look back and find for an opening balance restatement. I think it won't be as heavy of a lift, but once people have people in place again to do this, that's kind of my hunch.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. What I think the heavy lift is, or the issue for most entities, is the same record you hear played over and over again everywhere. There's just not enough bandwidth for most of these organizations to do their current day jobs and to turn around and adopt a couple significant standards like 87 and 96. And I agree with Rosemary that 96 in theory should be easier because it's very much focused on information technology agreements, whereas 87 was broad. It was look at all of your agreements, particularly service agreements of any type, and see and make sure that there's a lease, not a lease in there, or if there is a lease, that you account for it properly. So I think bandwidth is going to be the biggest issue. But the other big issue in terms of both of these standards represent a significant change in the way we approach recording these items. Leases were always one of those things that were always off balance sheet. They were mainly an operating expense unless they were, quote, capital leases. But they were just one of those expenses that were always out there. These subscription agreements with technology, if we're using software, if we're using assets and we're paying a monthly fee, those have been viewed for all of time as mainly expenses because we didn't think we bought anything. We weren't buying assets that we were using. And so both of these standards represent a wholesale change in the way we think and approach these items. So I think that's the biggest lift, is to ask people to turn around their reporting processes, the way they're thinking, and their internal controls over these items.
Rosemary, Mike, great insights. Again, I really enjoyed chatting with you two, and thanks a lot for taking the time. We'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.